Welcome to a Wooden Pulpit Media production, continuing our discussion on St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, this time part 4, the slaughter in Paris. The massacre had begun early in the morning with the death of Admiral Coligny, which we covered last time. His body thrown out the window so the Duke of Guise could identify it. And from that point, the bells began to ring from the Catholic churches, and the tension that had been building up, really since the marriage, but especially since the attempted assassination of Coligny, the Catholics were ready and were out in arms, expecting a Huguenot response and uprising, and they came with white crosses and white armbands, ready to break down the doors of any Huguenot they knew. And those in Paris, some estimate the church in Paris was about 5,000 members, were hunted down and killed, or sometimes intimidated in such ways with such horrible and heartbreaking scenes. There was a young girl named Agnes who was just a child, and she was immersed in her parents' blood, who were killed before her eyes. And horrible threats were made to her that if she were to ever become a Huguenot and to ever renounce the Catholic faith, they would come back and do that to her, just as she had been watched while she's being dipped in her blood. This is the sort of bloodlust that was going on in the streets. A Catholic minister of France, a foreign policy man, wrote a letter during the time. He was actually Spanish, but was stationed in France. Wrote back to Philip II, "As I write, they're killing them all. They're stripping them naked, dragging them through the streets, plundering the houses, and sparing not even children. Blessed be God who has converted the French princes to his cause. May inspire their hearts to continue as they have begun." This was the attitude of the Catholics in Paris as they began to kill ruthlessly the Protestants. There were those rare times where some Catholics helped Protestants escape the massacre, maybe because of love, because of affection. A man who would become the future Duke of Sully, who was 12 years old at the time, when he was studying under a Catholic tutor. The Catholic tutor hid him for the first few days of the massacre before sending him ultimately on his way out of the city, putting an armband around him, putting in his hand books of Thomas Aquinas and Catholic readings so that no one would stop him and he could escape. A 12-year-old boy. That would have to be the way the Huguenots would often escape. In the palace, where many of the Huguenot nobles, and including the new husband of Prince Marguerite, King Henry of Navarre, were the slaughter continued. King Henry of Navarre himself was spared, along with his closest kin, the Prince of Conde, who's also named Henry. They were forced to convert to Catholicism, and until they had agreed to do so and to take the Mass, the men that were their attendants were brought before their face and killed, slaughtered. Are you going to take the Mass, or will you die? If not, kill this man. Marguerite was said to have saved two by begging her family. One who had come to her room wounded, waking her up in the middle of the night, and another that she begged because she knew he was so important to her now husband who had converted. Don't kill this man, because my husband needs him. Those two were spared. It's said that when Henry arrived in town, he arrived with 80 attendants, and it appears all but two were killed, many in front of his face. The other Huguenot nobles who were still in the palace were rounded up and sent into the courtyard, where they were hacked and butchered to death by men with halberds, and their bodies laid out, so often stripped naked and laid out, so the ladies of the court could come by and gawk at them. Such was the morality of the court. there were many who were killed. The leading nobles of the Huguenot cause were cut down this day. The Marquis of Risnel was murdered by, ultimately, his brother who wanted to be the Marquis. He converted to Catholicism, killed his Huguenot brother, and went on. Francis de Caumont was a Huguenot noble who was killed, and his sons were killed. One of his sons ended up surviving because he was so covered in his family's blood that he fell down with a moan as if someone had just cut him, and everyone assumed he was dead because he was so already covered in blood. He laid there all day and night before being able to get away, having to pretend he was dead. Coligny's son-in-law, a man named Charles Coligny, who had been with him in the hotel, had tried to escape by climbing to the roof and jumping from roof to roof, was shot down and died from his wounds. The massacre was not just a one-day thing. People would come in fear as they could, and as they escaped, they would run to the palace. And it's said that at some point, even Charles IX himself took up a gun and shot down the Huguenots who were coming to the palace to beg for mercy, not just on August 24th, but on the days that came. There were 3 days of major massacres, and it really was on the August the 26th, that third day, where Charles finally was able to gather together some of the leading members of the Parliament of Paris and try to explain to them what had happened. And the official story was that Coligny and the others were participating in a plot to overthrow the government, and that's why they all had to be killed. And he was willing to admit that perhaps outside the walls of the palace it had gotten out of hand. Even in this picture here, you can see the killing going on outside the walls, even as he tries to explain what has happened. It was also on that third day, the 26th of August, that Peter Ramnus, a famous Huguenot philosopher, would be killed. He had successfully hidden for 3 days, but was finally tracked down in a library and was killed, his blood staining the floor. Killings would go sporadically on for at least a week, 3 days of heavy killing, and then sporadic killings on the 7th day. A week after the massacre began, the king, in an attempt to try to restore order, marches through the streets, having a royal parade of sorts to show that it was safe to come outside again, that order had been restored. But some Huguenot tries to slip into the parade and march with the king, and he's spotted by the crowd, and they jump out and kill him in the middle of the parade with the king. And the king is supposedly have said, "Dear God, let that be the last." And he continued on. The massacre in Paris then lasted for a full week. 3 days of intense killing, and 7 days total before order was really able to be restored. And that's just in Paris. We'll talk about numbers at a future date as they vary wildly, but probably at the least 2,000 Huguenots killed that day in Paris. The massacre, however, of St. Bartholomew's Day is by no means to be considered just one day, but really the season of massacres, the beginning on St. Bartholomew's Day and spreading throughout all of France, which we will talk about next time. And I do hope that you will be with us and be able to watch again. You can hit like or subscribe so that you won't miss any of our future videos. Thank you for watching.